significant aspect of institutional racism is that those who administer procedures having racist impact may not be racist. That is, they may not personally have racist attitudes. So institutional racism, in order to exist, does not need people who are racist. Or put differently, institutional structural racism is systematic and does not need identifiable agents to occur. However, past overt racism contributes to institutional racism if Blacks suffer from harm because of the historical consequences of past overt racism, right? So certain practices or institutions, can even be beliefs that were previously overt, can historically exist and result in devastating negative racial impact. And there are some examples of neutral procedures that have had very significant negative racist impact. Within employment, we have personal connections. Most people hear about jobs through personal connections. Personal connections is, again, something that is neutral. But because of racism, Blacks and whites live in different communities. So to the extent that whites have greater access to jobs, they benefit. So even this policy of personal connections works to the disadvantage of Blacks. Qualification standards. Qualification standards sometimes can be irrelevant, but even if they're relevant, Blacks, again, because they live in segregated neighborhoods, may not have the same educational opportunities as whites. And hence, again, we have an institutional or systemic situation that imposes negative racial impact on Blacks as a group. It could be something as innocuous as seniority status, or innocent as seniority status. For last hired, first fired, okay? Historically, Blacks, again, have been excluded from full participation in the job market. So to the extent that they are the last hired, they're the first fired, and seniority status, again, is an institutional practice. It is racially neutral, but can have devastating racial impact. So all three of these procedures are connected to residential segregation. And of course, residential segregation can either be overt or it could be institutional, right, covert. Another example of institutional racism at work is in the criminal justice system. The idea of qualified immunity that policemen enjoy, right? That is something, again, that people can engage in all kinds of illegal and immoral behavior. And if you're a police officer, you could hide behind qualified immunity. The cash bail system. This is something that has, again, a disproportionately negative impact on the Black community. People have to go to court, and if they want to get released, they have to come up with cash bail. And this creates a problem for people who don't have the necessary financial resources. Mandatory sentencing is another example of something within the criminal justice system. It may appear to be racially neutral, but again, have a devastating negative impact on Blacks. Now, that's one perspective. I think that's one way of approaching the notion of institutional or structural racism. But there are other approaches. And since the 1960s civil rights movement, there's been this notion that there is less racism, or there's really, or some people say really is really no significant amount of racism in society. And I think that when people say that, they tend to be thinking about individual overt racism, where one individual may say to another person, Black person, I'm going to cause you harm, or I'm going to withhold benefits simply because of your race. But there's something now called the new racism, and it is colorblind racism, right? So a lot of people may appeal to the notion of colorblindness to say, look, I'm not a racist, or society is colorblind, there's no racism. But the irony of the situation is that some people, and I think correctly, have said, well, we have a new racism. It's a colorblind racism. Go back to the point I made about social cultural concepts. social cultural concepts are fuzzy, they're contested. And just as these social cultural phenomena change, concepts must be revised to, as it were, adapt to those changing realities. So the new racism is colorblind racism. And here I'm going to be drawing on Eduardo Bonilla Silva and his book, Racism Without Races, Colorblind Racism and the Persistence of Racial Inequality in America. Now, Bonilla Silva's work is a challenge, he says, to post-civil rights white common sense. And by post-civil rights white common sense, he means the view that race no longer matters. And he says also a challenge to anyone who believes that the problems affecting people of color are fundamentally rooted in their pathological cultures. His proposal, he says, is to first advance an agenda that focuses on the sophisticated nature of colorblind racism. Second, he also wants to analyze racial ideology and not prejudice, right? So the old view was that racism is simply a matter of prejudice, but what he wants to say, well, it's not just simply prejudice in the psychological sense. We need to look at how racial ideology operates in a society, because again, ideologies are political instruments. And thirdly, he says that he wants to fight racial discrimination based on the notion of group rights and not individual rights, right? There are severe limits to adequately fighting against racism, mobilizing the notion of individual rights. So ultimately, he says, he urges moving away from claiming to be non-racist and instead to think in terms of becoming anti-racist, right? Non-racist is too passive, right? You just, all one has to do to be non-racist is to, as it were, declare one's allegiance to certain abstract notions. But what he thinks that the issue is to become anti-racist, which is more passive. More active. It requires engaging, right, activity. So why anti-racist? He says, because being anti-racist begins with understanding the institutional nature of racial matters and accepting that all actors in a racialized society are affected materially and ideologically by the racial structure. This then implies taking responsibility for one's unwilling participation in practices and beginning a new life committed to the goal of achieving real racial equality. And this point goes back to my first point, right? Becoming anti-racist means realizing that we find ourselves in a situation, first born and then agree to being born, and then being born into a world that you're really structured, so to speak. So according to Bonilla Silva, then there's a new racism. He says is a form of racism without races. This new racism is not explained exclusively in terms of the actor's racial views, meaning in terms of an individual psychological disposition, which would be prejudice. On his view, he says the new racism is a colorblind racism. When people say, well, I don't see race, I don't see color. There's something funny about that, because we're trying to frame a progressive position on the basis of a physical disability. So there are limitations to this notion of colorblindness. So he wants to say then that the new racism, the colorblind racism, is not fundamentally an attitudinal phenomena, right? And he wants to say it is more structural. And then this leads us into his idea, his claim that we should think about institutional racism as primarily a structure, meaning a network of social relations at the social, political, economic, and ideological levels of society that shape the life chances of various races in a society. Here, it is important to understand that institutional or structural racism is not something that can be addressed by mechanical or hydraulic means, nor is it just simply a game of numbers, meaning making minor adjustments. It also requires fundamental changes in the non-material areas of our society: legal, moral, political, and social life. Now, the elements then that, according to Vanilla Silva, that compromise the new racial structure, right, or this new racism, this colorblind racism, are the covert nature of racial discourse and racial practices. It's not overt, but covert. The avoidance of racial terminology, colorblindness, claims of reverse discrimination by whites. And he says, fourth, the promotion of a racial agenda over political matters that do not directly appeal to racial ideology, terminology. So there's a lot of dog whistling that takes place. You talk about race without actually using racial language, okay? So the main components then of the main components of the new colorblind racism are the frames or the set of maps, cognitive maps, for interpreting and making sense of information. And the most salient component of the new or the colorblind racism is abstract liberalism. And by liberalism, I don't mean that you vote for the Democratic Party or that you support a specific set of social policy. This notion of liberalism here, you must forgive me, is more kind of a technical philosophical notion. That is to say, all modern political discourse is liberal. Why is that? Here's why. It is rooted in the idea of individualism, right? Society is primarily an aggregate, a collection of individuals. Groups are fictions. There are no real political groups, racial groups, or even ethnic groups. Group talk is ghost talk. What's real are individuals. Individuals are real. Political reality is an aggregate, a collection of individuals. A second element of this abstract liberalism is the idea of choice. It says, since each individual is free to make his or her own choices, your position in society, where you are in society, is a reflection of the choices that you have made. And you, the individual, must assume responsibility for the choices that you have made. So clearly on this view then, talking about institutional racism or structural racism is a waste of time. Rather, we need to talk about individuals and individuals making choices, whether those choices are fortunate or unfortunate. A third element of abstract liberalism is the idea of state neutrality. The primary job or the purpose or function of the state is to protect individual rights. The government, in other words, should not interfere with culture and civil society, but just simply protect individual rights. The government should not go around telling people what they should and shouldn't do, particularly in the civil sphere. In the realm of culture, the government should be neutral and just simply stick to protecting individual rights. Fourth element of abstract individualism is formal equality of opportunity, right? The idea is that we're all equal before the law. Hence, we see here, there's no concern with substantive equality, and this whole notion of formal equality of opportunity or equal opportunity, it creates a false equivalence, because it says, well, we're all individuals, and as individuals, we're all equal before the law, but there's no attention paid to group differentials in society, that you have different groups with different degree of power, influence, and such like. So this new structural or institutional racism is, among other things, the practice of hiding behind the rhetoric of liberalism, political liberalism. And the problem with liberalism is that when you see only isolated individuals, you don't see the structures that maintain Black subordination. Indeed, the appeal by Blacks for justice appear to be noise. When Blacks appeal for social justice, it's like they're just making noise. What they're saying isn't intelligent, it's not coherent within the existing political discourse. So using the dominant political, moral, and legal concepts, theories, and principles, there's no accounting then for historical injustice. Remember, the injustice that really matters is the injustice of one individual harming another individual. And we're told that historical injustice no longer matters because the victims and the perpetrators are long dead. They're gone. So we can't do anything with historical injustice. All we can worry about is making sure that when one individual harms another individual, the harmed individual is compensated. But historical injustice, the idea that certain groups suffer certain historical wrongs, we can't make sense of that. Or actually, there's really no way in the judicial system of addressing those kinds of harms. And I think reparations is a case in point. So, it will see then, we could conclude that this is my 7-point conclusion then, is that we have a situation that one feature of institutional racism, structural racism, is the neutral criteria that can have negative racial impact. The new racism that Bonilla Silva talks about, colorblind racism, is again, a structural kind of racism where you don't need to have agents, identifiable agents, but again, simply you have structures in place, social, political, economic structures that function in such a way as to disadvantage and disadvantage Blacks. The point here is that negative racial impact is not accidental. It is not accidental. It is systematic, meaning it affects multiple aspects of the lives of Black people. And it carries on throughout life. If you, unfortunately, end up because of residential segregation, live in the area and where there are no good good educational opportunities, that can affect your whole life. It's not accidental, so that's what gives it this kind of systemic nature. So we're talking about economic, educational, professional, legal, and political effect on individuals. Again, we have to move away from the notion of society as an aggregate of isolated individuals and understand society, for want of a better way of putting it, is really structures, institutions, practices, not isolated individuals doing their own thing. And we also, again, need to, as it were, avoid being seduced by the notion of colorblindness. And again, instead of talking about just simply these abstract individuals with a body of rights and stuff like that, we need, as a society, to start talking about responsibility for the past and come to appreciate how the past infuses the present. If we keep on talking about color blindness and such like, then we make ourselves the victims of an unfortunate blindness to history. We don't see and we fail to appreciate the ways in which history informs what we do. All right, I think, 6:05, I think that's pretty good. So thank you. So now I'm ready for questions, comments, suggestions.
Right. So we're going to put the questions and comments in the chat box. If you have never used chat, if you look sort of at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the word chat in a bubble. And if you can write in your chat question, then Dr. Headley will answer them in the order that he receives them.
Or
so Clevis,
okay.
the first question is from Donald Singer.
Mm-hmm.
And Donald Singer asks, how does one differentiate between an innate construct by dangers of a complex society and a false construct created to elevate the creators?
Well, among other things, we turn to history. You know, for the last 500 years, we have enough historical evidence that can guide us in terms of, you know, what is an acceptable construct and what is not an unacceptable construct. However, I think here's the thing with the case of race: we have ourselves in a bind. Even if we start off with the idea or the claim that race was an unfortunate construct, that's no longer the case. We have to keep race as an analytical category, because without race, we wouldn't be able to understand our world. And without race, we wouldn't be able to understand some very stubborn problems. So that's part of our predicament.
Okay, and then the next question we have is from Drazia Simon. And the question is, so how do we dismantle institutional racism?
Yeah, that's very hydraulic. I think that we think about institutional racism, those kind of mechanical terms about dismantling. We remember when we think about it, we're thinking about it in terms of it being just simply material structures, but it's more than that. It is material and it's also non-material. So as I was getting at that, when we talk about institutional racism, part of it has to deal with our main core political, legal, and moral concepts, principles, and theories. So it's as though we have to create a new culture, and you can't create a new culture. So that's a very, very difficult thing. So in terms of how to deal with institutional racism, it is an infinite task. It's an infinite task. It is perpetual, right? This is something that we, to the extent that we assume that responsibility, it is hard to say, okay, we've reached a point we can stop. That's what we did in the 1960s, and it was a big mistake.
The follow-up from that question is there value to affirmative action, or is that a Band-Aid?
Oh, there's great value to affirmative action, right? Remember, as a society, we invested a lot of effort and a lot of money in destroying affirmative action and completely distorting it. I probably wouldn't be here were it not for affirmative action. In the past, prior to affirmative action, if you wanted to be a professor and you were a Black person, there's only one way you would have gotten the job. That was at a predominantly Black university. No white university would have hired any Black person to be a philosopher. It would have been unheard of. So there's a great, a tremendous amount of value to affirmative action.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is from Manju Pendakur. Thank you for your lecture. When we talk about changing structures, policies, and institutions, we run up against white fragility. Can you talk about that concept and its realities in contemporary America?
Well, let me handle it this way. That's the reason why I started off with talking about existence and history, to sort of get people to understand that, again, your birth is probably one of the most significant things that happened to you. But no one had a choice in his or her birth, right? Sort of born into the world, right? Is the consequences of Friday night dinner in the movie, okay? Then now my stomach got a baby. So about 500 years ago, people decided to structure the world on the basis of race. So people were born into a world and they weren't responsible for constructing that world, but that world nevertheless bestowed a lot of benefits on people. So part of it is white. That's why I think part of the notion of white fragility is tied to this notion. I'm an individual. I'm not responsible for the past. I make my own choices. I work hard. So there's this blindness to history that then motivates people to think that somehow they're being victimized. Something that rightfully belonged to them is sort of like being taken from them, and because they're operating in a situation, they're operating out of context. And I don't know, that's how I respond to that question.
Okay, this one is a little bit of a long one from Jessica Frank.
Okay.
The question is about the second point about racial structure with respect to real racial effects. There is a very real, thorough line in terms of affirmative action and the Voting Rights Act. that through line is social atomism and philosophical liberalism.
Mhm.
The United States have largely taken the position of comparative legal theory, that is, a combination of common law and civil law. However, there is a disproportionate appeal to common law practice, where the major difference becomes one of the laws based on custom. It becomes judgment based, judgment becomes moderators, as opposed to those who enforce the law. Civil law requires that we apply the laws as written, not as we interpret them.
Mhm.
We typically under-enforce laws as written, using the fact that most cases before the courts are not in effect, identical, thereby requiring interpretation. With respect to institutional racism, the law has therefore become colorblind or race neutral to the detriment of people of color. How then can we affirm race as positive social construct against the liberal backdrop, a type of callous and sinister liberalism that has ultimately become liberal? We ignore the rights of some to the benefit of others. We become trapped between positive and negative freedoms, consistently and almost incoherently moving between the two when we see fit, or when doing so appeals to our preferred narrative. How do we move past this? How can we maintain the underlying principle of liberalism while also allowing for a more collective approach to how we structure our society, one that affirms the existential reality of race as a positive and necessary feature of reality, a reality that recognizes that we live in a world with other people, but does not require that we completely abandon liberalism as a fundamental feature of Western democracy.
Yeah. All right. Good. I understand. Thank you. Well, certainly we can't, what should I say, reject liberalism, lock, stock, and barrel. So part of the problem is that the modern world is intimately constructed on the basis of liberalism, but we find a situation now where liberalism is blunt, or the basic concepts of liberalism aren't working. So there's one way, however, of looking at this, and it's not a solution. I think it just underscores that the task ahead of us is a very, very, very difficult task. And there's a group of Black scholars, and they support something called Afro-pessimism. And the basic thesis of Afro-pessimism is that Black people are still seen as, in some sense, as slaves. And to be seen as a slave is to be non-human. And today I'm saying that you're non-human, the basic categories of liberalism, individualism, and freedom and stuff like that simply don't apply to you. So we're at this situation where we have a liberal tradition that appears or sounds very, very, very progressive, but at the same time, the way how we practice our liberalism, it doesn't enable us to deal with these serious issues, particularly the issues of race. So this again is particularly difficult, and again, the common sense view of how we're supposed to solve these problems, the common sense view appears to be inadequate, and there are no easy answers. That doesn't mean that we should try. There are no easy answers.
Thank you. We have another question from Joyce Strickland. And Joyce says, thank you, Dr. Headley. Could you please spell out the author whose work you cited?
The second author, the name is Eduardo, Eduardo. That's the first name. And his last name is Bonilla Silva, Bonilla -SILVA.
Okay, if I may interrupt, that has been posted in the chat. So if anybody is interested, his name is there, and there's also an Amazon link that would take you to his book.
That's great, great.
Thank you. Also, there's a question from Abby Clates that says, I am currently reading Calvin Baker's A More Perfect Reunion, an outstanding explanation and tour of how we got here. His main premise, as I understand it, that the only way to grow is through total integration of our society. Please share a comment.
A lot of people have revisited that topic. That's actually very important work by a philosopher who talks about the imperative of integration. And I guess what we can say is, in one sense, integration is also grounded in liberalism. And I think the new interest in integration, I think, is to say, look, you know, perhaps we did it the wrong way. In the 70s and 80s, we had the wrong model of integration. And essentially what it was to dismantle, again, Black institutions and just simply invite Black people to, you know, to join in mainstream white institutions. That probably didn't work well. And the empirical evidence suggests that we are still a very, very extremely a segregated society. So I think the impulse behind the focus on integration is to say that we need to do something about fighting, or at least getting beyond segregation, and perhaps even what would happen if we were to literally start to take our ideals and ideas seriously.
Also, to follow up on that is, can you speak of your opinion on reparations and how this concept can work?
I have nothing, I mean, for historical reasons, I obviously support reparations. However, from a scholarly perspective, from a legal, moral, and political perspective, our legal system, our moral tradition, and our legal system cannot accommodate the idea of historical reparations for African Americans. And the reason why, as a matter of fact, all the cases, reparation cases that have been to the courts have been rejected, legally rejected, not on superficial grounds, but on real legal grounds. First thing is standing, statutes of limitations. So there are a lot of technical legal reasons why the efforts by African Americans to ask for reparations haven't worked. For once, a quick example, please bear with me. We recognize individual cases of individual reparations. One individual harms another individual. The perpetrator and the victims are alive, okay? In the case of reparations for Black Americans, the perpetrators and the actual victims are what? They're dead and gone. So an individualistic model of reparations wouldn't work. As another point is that with individual reparations, there's a causal link between the perpetrator and the victim. In the case of historical reparations, the historical link have been broken. So I do support reparations. However, I think that our current legal, moral, and political frameworks cannot adequately accommodate demands for reparations by African Americans, and that's part of the predicament. But I'm working on it.
Thank you. This one is from Narissa Santiago. Taking all of this into consideration, structural racism, white fragility, colorblind racism, what do I do? How should I apply this to my existence? How do I apply this knowledge to be an authentic individual?
Well, again, it's a question of realizing how one is situated in the world. And, you know, I mean, I don't want to sound simplistic, but, you know, people get involved to, again, try to change certain kinds of practices. But again, also remember that one of the stubborn things about structural racism is that you yourself may not be a racist, but you may find yourself in a situation where you have to implement policies that have particularly negative racist racial impact. So I think a lot of it, that what people can do is fight to become anti-racist and spread the word, you know, start talking and sort of find ways to combat the rhetoric of color blindness and such like, because I think that creates a lot of problems when we talk that way. So I think it's the issue of trying to get our friends or families and our neighbors to look at things differently, to not to say, well, I don't see race, but to say, you know what, I see race, and there's a good way of seeing race. There is a correct way of seeing race. I think very quickly, I think what we've done is to treat race as this kind of irrational accident, and instead of understanding when the framers of the Constitution got together, although they didn't use the word slavery, they wrote a document to protect slavery. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they knew that they were using the Constitution, as it were, to as it were, create a white race. That's history. That's not biology. As a matter of fact, race has nothing to do with biology. That's a non-starter. It is a social, a political, and legal issue.
Thank you. We have another question from Ron Pomerantz. Looking further back than 500 years, were there no similar constructs of racism in ancient Greece and Roman societies, and even further back to ancient Egypt, hundreds of years BC? That's one question. And then Noah Yuval Hari equates this to the development of certain fictions going back to time that Homo sapiens first left Africa. So in that sense, where does the structural nature of societal change DNA begin?
Where does it begin? All societies are structural. All societies are institutional. All societies have practice. That's our human DNA. We create these, what should I call it, abstractions, these complex things, because we want our lives to be meaningful. So these things are characteristics of all societies. It is just that different societies use different kinds of materials or resources. I don't know if perhaps that's good enough for the time being. But I don't think it's a question of going back to the ancient Egyptians. I think what we need to do is to understand the modern world, right? Understand our world. You know, I'm happy to be in a college of arts and letters. I'm happy to have Dean Horsfeld as my dean, because I think we do some very important work. How do you educate people to understand the nature of our social political reality and the powerful forces that shape us as human beings? I mean, the biologists can tell us about our bones and our cells and stuff like that, but none of us wake up in the middle of the night worrying about, I wonder how my skeleton is doing. No, we worry about our identity, right? We worry about the meaning of our lives. We worry about freedom. So we spend most of our lives worrying about these sort of things that people in the humanities and the social sciences discuss, not what people in the biology and the other places discuss most of the time.
Thank you. One other question is from Diane and John Desmar, saying, isn't the heart of change in our education systems?
Oh, absolutely. Education has has a great role to play. And you're right, as educators, we can't escape that responsibility. And I think that's part of what we're doing right now, right? We're living up to that responsibility, right? Of having these kinds of discussions. Absolutely. And actually notice here too, I think this is important why we want academics to be involved in these discussions. These aren't discussions for the web, Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. I think there what we get is a lot of nonsense, garbage, put it that way. Right, we do need respectable scholars to actively participate in these kinds of debates, and that's right. And so the universities have a very, very important role to play. Absolutely.
And we have a comment. Your argument about reparations argument might hold true if you define it true based on slavery, but if you look at the continuing of social and governmental policy to this day, it seems that current world owes based on policies that have continued to this day, from Reconstruction to redlining to police brutality.
Well, Reconstruction wasn't yesterday. Reconstructions happened way back way, right? So there's a historical connection, absolutely. There's a historical connection, right? So I don't think you could escape the historical reality of the situation, right? So even if you, again, even you say, well, let's start with Jim Crow, again, Jim Crow doesn't exist in a void, right? There's a history to it, right? So part of it then is again, understanding that looping effect of history. We make history, but we don't make history under our own choices. History also imposes certain things on us. And I think we've done a rather poor job of trying to understand our history. What we have done is to institutionalize blindness to history. So even when we talk about reparations, I say, right, you don't have to go back and talk about everything that happened during slavery. But actually, let me mention something here. Philosopher, I get an opportunity to flap my big mouth. We understand slavery only as an economic enterprise, right? In terms of profit. Yeah, that was part of it. But slavery was more than just simply an economic enterprise. We must look in terms of how the sexual abuse and exploitation connected to slavery, right? Why is people, among other things, had an interest in maintaining the institutions for non-economic reasons. We must look at the fact that slavery was used as a way to create wealth by, quite frankly, breeding slaves, right? It wasn't just simply people bought slaves to put them to work. The idea was, if I can buy slaves and increase the number of slaves that I have, I can sell them and make money. So even slavery itself is something that we haven't done a very good job of understanding, and that we tend to see it merely as an economic enterprise. And there was a more to it than just simply economic interest. So I don't know if I answered the question, but that's sort of what I'm saying.
Two final comments. One is from Joyce Strickland. Asheville, North Carolina City Council voted unanimously for reparations in the form of higher education. That was one comment.
Yeah. I mean, that's the, would you say the city council? Yeah, yes. but they don't have the money to implement it, right?
I think they use the state college system,
Yeah,
state university system.
In the state of Florida?
No, North Carolina.
North Carolina? Well, again, you know, that's those sorts of policies. You may have one or two exceptions, but it's not something that is across the board, right? That's an isolated case, right? That's an isolated case. And the question is, well, how long are they going to continue it? Or under what conditions are they doing it? And quite frankly, that's nothing that's new. I think all the states in the United States support community college. So that's nothing that's really new. So I don't, you know, yeah, you could say, well, it's part of a reparations agenda, but that's something that's already being done. That's something that's already available.
Thank you.
And Clevis at 6:30, and the final comment is thank you, Dr. Headley, for sharing your knowledge from Jeff Groves.
All right, thank you. It's fun.
Actually, from all of us. We
Thank you.
very much appreciate your being here.
Well, thank you very much.
Michael?
Thank you, Dr. Headley.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Headley. That was a wonderful lecture, and I know we all learned a lot of incredible knowledge there, and you can see how fortunate our students are at FAU to have professors like Dr. Headley leading discussions like this. And that's what I love about OSHER, is because these kinds of classes continue into your working life and even your retirement. You can come back to class and have these kinds of conversations with us here at the Lifelong Learning Institute of FAU. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation this afternoon. We're going to keep the Zoom open for another 30 minutes. So you can ask any further questions, have any conversation amongst yourselves. We'll unmute the mics for that. And I just want to let you know that next week, July 27th, same time, 5:30, is the second in this four-part series. And that will be, the topic will be defunding police, phenomenon and consequences. And it features an assistant professor from the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice in the College of Social Work and Criminal Justice at FAU. And that is Dr. Seth Fallick. So Dr. Fallick will be here next week, and the dean of that college will be introducing him, and that is Nayalise Luna. So Dr. Luna and Dr. Fallick will be with us next week. So please come back. I think we put in the chat the other two, we have two more afterwards. And so if you haven't seen the flyer, we have flyers for all of these talks. I think they're going to be very exciting going forward into August. And I thank you all for being here. So I'm going to turn this back over to our hosts from our board, of OSHR board, Ron and Andreja.